Hello students, this week's collaborative learning assignment is a discussion on the biological and psychodynamic theories to explain abnormal behavior or mental illness. And you also have a quiz this week on Thursday, excuse me, that is going to be on the same topic, on models of abnormality, but it's going to be on all of the models of abnormality that are within the module and within chapter 2 of your textbook. So this course is laid out in terms of the modules that you see online. Every week you're going to have a new module that you go through. It's got text, it's got videos embedded within the text, it's got diagrams, figures for you to study up. And those can be used to respond well in your discussions as well as study up for your quizzes. So you want to make sure to engage with the modules every week. And you want to use your textbook to cite examples from for your discussions especially. I want you to be pulling examples from the text and citing those examples when you give your opinion and statements in your discussion so that other students know where to go. Like, oh, that was a really interesting point that they had and they cited Comer on page 53. I'm going to go to that page and figure out how they came to that conclusion. That's a really good place for me to go in my studies. And that's how I want you to be engaging with each other and learning from each other. I think you guys did a really good job in the first week's discussion on clinical research methods, and I just want to see more engagement, more interaction with the different materials. This week's video is on the biological model as well as the psychodynamic model to help you with your discussion in the collaborative learning assignment, as well as on the quiz on Thursday. So if you have any questions, you can post to this video or you can post in the announcement. And I will talk to you guys soon.
How do biological theorists explain abnormal behavior? The first area of examination is brain anatomy. The brain is made up of approximately 100 billion nerve cells, called neurons, and thousands of billions of support cells, called glia. Within the brain, large groups of neurons form distinct brain regions. Clinical researchers have discovered connections between certain psychological disorders and problems in specific brain areas. In depressed patients, many areas of the brain are hypoactive, and in schizophrenic patients, there's actually an expansion of the ventricles leading to a decrease in brain matter. For example, Huntington's disease, which is marked by violent emotional outbursts, memory loss, involuntary body movements, and absurd beliefs, is linked to a severe loss of cells within the basal ganglia and cortex that supply dopamine to the brain. Another area of examination by biopsychologists is brain chemistry. Information is communicated throughout the brain in the form of electrical impulses that travel from one neuron to another or more. An impulse first is received at a neuron's dendrites, travels down the axon, and is transmitted through the nerve endings to other neurons. Neurons actually don't touch at all. They are actually separated by a space known as the synapse. And in the synapse, messages can be communicated. When an electrical impulse reaches a nerve ending, the ending is stimulated to release a chemical. This chemical is known as a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter travels across the synaptic space and then it can interact at receptors at the neighboring cell, otherwise known as the postsynaptic cell. So out of the presynaptic cell, neurotransmitters are released at the nerve ending, or the terminal. The neurotransmitter travels across the synapse and then it can attach to receptors upon the dendrite of a neighboring cell. Some neurotransmitters tell the neighboring neuron to fire so that the postsynaptic neuron will become more excitable. Whereas other neurotransmitters are inhibitory and tell the postsynaptic cell to stop firing. A common excitatory neurotransmitter is glutamate, whereas a common inhibitory neurotransmitter is GABA. Studies indicate that abnormal activity of certain neurotransmitters can lead to specific mental disorders. For example, depression has been linked to low levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. Another area of investigation of the biological model is genetic abnormalities. Abnormalities in brain anatomy or chemistry are sometimes the result of genetic inheritance. Each human cell contains about 30,000 genes, some of which may contribute to mental disorders. Each cell in the human body contains 23 pairs of chromosomes, each with numerous genes that control the characteristics and traits a person inherits. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2000, helps identify the precise contribution of various genes to mental disorders. In fact, studies suggest that inheritance plays a part in mood disorders, schizophrenia, and many other mental disorders, including substance abuse. So what are the ways the biological model attempts to treat mental disorders? Well, we have three main methods of biological treatments. We have drug therapy, such as the use of anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressant drugs, anti-bipolar drugs or mood stabilizers, and antipsychotic drugs that are used to treat schizophrenia. We also have electroconvulsive therapy, which is used to treat severe depression, and it's actually extremely effective in treating severe clinical depression, although it does have some side effects such as memory impairment afterwards. A third avenue of biological treatment is psychosurgery or neurosurgery, and this has its roots in the first lobotomies that were done in the 1930s. Since then, we have refined the technique to do surgical interventions in the brain to remove specific areas or sever specific connections to alleviate things like Tourette syndrome and epilepsy. Now let's go over the psychodynamic model of abnormality. The psychodynamic model is the oldest and most famous psychological model. It is based on the belief that a person's behavior is largely determined by underlying dynamics, that is, interacting psychological forces of which he or she is not even aware. This model proposes that abnormal symptoms are the result of conflict among these forces. The father of psychodynamic theory and psychoanalytic therapy is Sigmund Freud. Freud argued that all behavior was caused by unconscious forces. One of these forces is known as the id, which is guided by the pleasure principle. It is comprised of instinctual needs, drives, and impulses. Another aspect of our unconscious forces underlying our behavior is the ego, which is governed by the reality principle. The ego seeks out gratification, but it also knows whether or not these goals are realistic and tends to temper the drives of the id. And finally, the superego is considered the moral center of the psyche and is guided by the morality principle. You can think of your superego as being a direct counterpoint to the id. So the id is seeking out purely instinctual needs, self-satisfaction, and the superego is guiding us to behave in a moral, conscientious way. The ego then is getting information and the drives from the id about seeking out pleasure, and getting information from the superego regarding morality. And the ego maintains a balance between the two to come about with behavior. Now, when we have conflict between these three unconscious forces, that's when you can get abnormality in behavior, according to Freud, when you have too much conflict between the id, the ego, and the superego. Although newer theories depart from Freud's ideas in important ways, each retains the belief that human functioning is shaped by dynamic forces that interact. Ego theorists emphasize the role of the ego and consider it independent and more powerful than Freud did. Self-theorists emphasize the unified personality over any one component. And object relations theorists emphasize the human need for healthy interpersonal relationships, especially between children and caregivers. So according to psychodynamic theorists, a healthy personality is one in which an effective working relationship and an acceptable compromise has been formed among the forces of the unconscious, among these dynamic forces that we're unaware of. So if the id, ego, and superego are in excessive conflict, where they do not have an acceptable compromise within each other, then the person's behavior may show signs of dysfunction that result in depression, substance abuse, schizophrenia, and so on. So what are the ways that we can treat from a psychodynamic perspective? The therapies underlying psychodynamic theory range from Freudian psychoanalysis to more modern therapies. All psychodynamic therapies seek to uncover past traumas and inner subconscious conflicts, where the therapist acts as a subtle guide in the process of figuring out where these conflicts come from. Psychodynamic theorists utilize a various amount of techniques. One of these is known as free association. This technique is when the patient describes any thought, feeling, or image that comes to mind to them, even if it seems unimportant. Psychodynamic therapists also encourage catharsis, which is the reliving of past repressed feelings in order to settle internal conflicts and overcome these problems. Psychodynamic therapists also use a term called working through, and this is the process of facing conflicts head on, the ability to reinterpret the patient's feelings and overcome the problems that the patient is feeling. This can take place over the course of many sessions, and psychoanalysis is known for being a therapy that lasts many years to uncover these unconscious conflicts to get at the source of a problem. So how can we accurately compare the biological model to the psychoanalytic model? Obviously, these models are very different in nature. The psychodynamic model is rooted in history. It has moved forward the psychological field so much and revealed our ability to talk about these disorders openly and try to figure out what the internal of a person is, get at the mind. And so that's had a huge positive impact on the field of psychology. I also think one of the benefits of the psychodynamic theory is the focus on the individual and really getting at the depths of the person that is experiencing the mental disorder. This is in contrast to the biological model, which gets away from the interpersonal approach, approaches mental disorders in terms of a brain disease. However, this has been very effective in terms of treatment. Drug therapies are one of the most popular and effective ways to treat mental disorders such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. In fact, regular talk therapy, psychoanalytic therapy, isn't very effective in treating disorders such as bipolar and schizophrenia. In those two cases, drug therapy is extremely effective. In disorders like depression, usually a combination of using an antidepressant along with an interpersonal therapy is very effective. So again, I think both of these models have value, a great deal of value, to learn more about the individual and learn more about the biological underpinnings that can explain these abnormalities in thinking and behavior. And I think it's best when we use them in conjunction with one another.